Good morning. I want to start my day in a way that I've been taught to start my day. And one of the elders that's my teacher, and she teaches with me at the university, and she comes with me on journeys, says, you start every day with Ninanaskoman, I am grateful. I am grateful for one more day to walk on Mother Earth. And then you start your list. If you're ever in an Indigenous ceremony and you don't understand the language that's being spoken when we come with prayer, it always starts with a list of gratitudes. And they have to be so specific that it could bring you to your knees and that you could weep. So you're not just grateful for your family, you're grateful for every member and you name them. You're grateful for the ability to speak, you're grateful for your ability to think, you're grateful for your ability to be employed, you're grateful for your grandchildren, you're grateful for. And it comes, not a coincidence, I love this, it comes from your heart. And so from my heart, I want to say thank you so much for the invitation to come and be part of your community today. As you heard, I'm a commissioner with the National Inquiry. The work of the National Inquiry is surrounded by politics, passion, violence, intrigue, death, destruction, dispossession. It's filled with trauma, PTSD, hopes and fears are part of this story. It's fueled by family, kinship law, resistance, and resilience. I have data, I have statistics, I have facts, I have figures, I have costs. Now, which story about the National Inquiry should I tell you today? Which story are we going to tell and hear and share as a community that comes together today? When you introduce yourself, when you meet someone, or you're asked to speak like this, what do you say? How would you introduce yourself? When you're getting to know someone, what would you say to them so they truly know who you are? Because we all have lots of stories we could tell. You focus on the one that you need to tell in a day. You might tell them where you're from. In Indigenous communities, that's the first line of order. Hi, what's your name? Where are you from? And we say, my name is Marilyn, Poitras or Poitras, depending on how you want to pronounce my name, and I'm from a little community called Indian Head, Saskatchewan, and I have an Irish-Scottish mother and a Cree-French father, and we called ourselves half-breeds most of the time. The politically correct word now is Métis. We should probably be saying Michif, but we have lots of labels. I could tell you that. The reason that we introduce ourselves like that is so that we have a context. Do I know who you are? Do I know your family? Do I know, if I know that you're from the South Qu'Appelle Valley in the province of Saskatchewan, it tells me something about you. If you come from a river or a lake area, it tells me something about you. If you come from water area, it tells me something about you. There's a reason that we ask, where are you from? What do you tell people? Do you talk about your accomplishments? Do you tell them how many children you have? Do you tell them about your losses? Do you tell them a long, clear description of your life, your employment, your people? Or do you talk about the weather? Do you talk about the latest or most prominent news that's available to you? Does Donald come up for you? We have a choice about what to share, who to share it with, and which story we're going to tell. We decide when we decide to speak what we will share. So my job, when I'm invited to speak now, is to talk about Indigenous women in Canada. It's something I know a lot about. I am an Indigenous woman. I am from this land. My ancestors are from this land. I can speak about that. But what do you know about Indigenous women? You might have your own family members that you draw from and you know about Indigenous women. You might have friends or neighbors or colleagues that will tell you about us. You might get your information about Indigenous women, girls, trans or two-spirited people from the media, from news, film, from stories, poems, from your friends. The most recent sort of prominent conversation around Indigenous people that would include, of course, Indigenous women shone a light on the painful process of the extraction of children from their Indigenous mothers and fathers in the form of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That has left a legacy of the role of how people are impacted when our babies are ripped away from their parents. That ripping, of course, is compounded by the brutal sexual, physical violence, emotional and spiritual violence, and death of cultural traditions within those children. The extraction of those children still continues today. You might have read about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. You might have heard it on the news in the last number of years and quite loudly now. You may know something about Indigenous women from that information. You might have ideas about the fact that when Indigenous women and girls or two-spirited transgendered people go missing or are murdered, we don't have a system in place and around our country that kicks in sufficiently or immediately enough to say, this is terrible. We have to stop this. We're outraged by it. I could tell you all about that. And I have lots of stories, I have lots of data, I have lots of facts that I could talk about. You could Google us. You could Google Indigenous women in Canada. Googling is a thing now. Googling Indigenous women in Canada is going to reflect the void of information about who we really are, because this information doesn't contain the stories of our power. If you Google Indigenous women in Canada, you're going to find out about our pain. That's not bad, that's not wrong, but that's not all of our story. So today, I want to highlight another part of our story. I want to talk to you about the strength of our women. I want to talk and come to you so that you know and you see and you understand through another lens who Indigenous women in Canada are. I want to bring us into your homes and your hearts and your life. I want one story to come that resonates with you as a woman or through the women in your life. The National Inquiry was commissioned by the federal government and has been supported by the provincial and territory governments. But, and this is a big but, it only exists, the National Inquiry only exists because of hundreds and thousands of women who came for years before it and said, this isn't good enough. You don't recognize our families and our women and our girls. And it took years to do this. Indigenous women, Indigenous men, two-spirited and transgendered people, and our non-Indigenous family members demanded it around this country. It was the right thing to do. it looks kind of like we got commissioned in August and we started in August, but we didn't actually start then. You know now that the work started years and years before. And that's very consistent with ceremony in our communities. Like any other ceremony, the preparation for this work was done far in advance of the commission coming together. And I want to tell you that I use the word ceremony quite intentionally. It's from my experience and it's in my conceptual understanding as an Indigenous woman raised in the prairies what ceremony is. And by ceremony, I mean a solemn process with people who are coming together with the intention to direct the flow of a relationship. Ceremony. We all have ceremony all the time. You have ceremony in your life all the time. We have ceremony for individuals, we have ceremonies for couples, families, communities, and nations. Ceremony shows up for birth, death, weddings, communities, coming of age of children, teenagers, for seasons, for potlatches, for moon ceremonies, for peace talks, for recognitions of firsts. We do it when we agree to share the land and take from the land, and many, many, many other reasons. Everybody knows ceremony somehow. The ceremony of the National Inquiry for me is to hold up the women of this land as honorable and sacred, as foundational to defining, maintaining, and leading all of us as a nation in Canada. The women I refer to have held space as our ancestors. They walk and move among us today, and they will guide us in our future. I want you to know them like that too. And so how am I going to tell this story? To tell this story, I've been inspired by the women in my own life. Women with the strength of conviction. My mother and her sisters, my aunts, my grandmothers, the women who are often children's first teachers, their first nurses, their first nurturers. My father's sisters, his mother, his ancestors, the ones I will share about you today. I have an aunt who was raised in the Qu'Appelle Valley as well. So my dad comes from a family of 12 siblings, and the second oldest is still alive. She's 92 years old. So they were raised in the valley, and so my dad is a half-breed from the road allowance. And the families that grew up in that area often took on, laborer jobs and house kept, things like that. So the sisters often grew up as housekeepers for local ranchers. And my dad's 92-year-old sister grew up as a housekeeper. And she raised her sons and she raised her grandchildren, and now she's helping with her great-grandchildren. She still keeps house for 2 people in our community. And she does it because they're part of her family now. It keeps her alive, it keeps her healthy, it keeps her vital. I have another aunt who was what I thought of as the matriarch of our family, and everybody collected and went to my Aunt Eva's house. Everybody went there, that's where families are welcome. People in town that found they had nowhere to go and nobody to turn to, they went to my Aunt Eva's house. So no matter where you were from or what you were doing, you could go to my Aunt Eva's house. And the reason I hold my Aunt Eva, who's passed now, close to my heart is she was funny all the time. And she was full of life no matter where she was and who was around her. And I had the opportunity to go to Boston and attend Harvard Law School to do a master's degree in law. And when I came home the summer after I was finished, I went to my home community and I met with a woman who I had worked with in the town, and she said, "Oh, I can't believe you're talking to us now. I thought you might think you were a little bit special after you got back from Boston." And I said, "What?" And then I heard, Marilyn, my girl." And I turned around, and there's my Auntie Eva standing in the middle of the street, and she had on a navy blue kind of turtleneck with no sleeves on it, and a wool hot pink pair of very short shorts. And she had kind of dress shoes on, and then knee-high stockings, but they weren't pulled all the way up to the knee. This was high fashion at the time. And she stood in the middle of the street in Indian Head, Saskatchewan, and she said, "Marilyn, my girl, you get over here right now." And so I said, "I'm sorry, I have to go." And I went over to my Auntie Eva, and she said, "Come here and give your auntie a hug." And so I went. I was crying. I was so happy to see her. I hadn't seen her in a year, and she loves me. And one of the shopkeepers came over, and he said, "Eva, this is your niece, and she's back from Boston." And she said, "I don't care where she's back from. Don't you ever forget where you're from. This is your home right here, right now. What's in Boston?" And so I will never forget who I am and where I'm from. And I have a joke that my dad never ever cared what kind of credentials I could flash. He cared that I didn't spill paint when I painted outside. And he tells people I teach at the university because if you go there long enough, they just keep you. So I get my inspiration from my family, and I've been trained to look around and see what the world is teaching me. And on a flight home recently, I was exhausted and thought, I just need to sort of put my brain in neutral, and I pulled the movie screen up, and there was a movie called Hidden Figures. And how many people in this room have seen Hidden Figures? It's quite amazing. It's quite moving. It's quite a story. And I started to think about all the hidden figures in my life. And I was sitting beside this sort of 20-something young man, and I cried through the whole movie. And he was just kind of handing me Kleenex and this way. I was so inspired by hidden figures. Who are the hidden figures in my life? There are many, many hidden figures in my life. I thought about the women who prepared the path for the arrival of new settlers and watched over our families and our lands long before the settlers got here. I thought about our ceremony keepers. When you come into a room like this and you have ceremony in a room like this, I wonder who put the banners up. And I wonder who cleans in here. And I wonder who comes and makes sure that the chairs are all in a nice, tidy circle before we get here. And who makes sure the piano's tuned, and who makes sure that everybody's comfortable when they're here. There's a whole community that goes into making that space. I wanted to talk about the women that I come from because the ones I'm meeting through the work and the inquiry that I'm doing are reminding me of what it must take to advocate, to teach, to love, and to just stand inside the stories that are making up the lives of these women. What kind of power do you have to stand inside of that? These women come from traditions and culture that has a rich, rich source of power. Traditional knowledge for many has guided them and keeps them safe and brings them home. Teachings from the land and through ceremony are the laws that never change, and many people rely on them today. Many are relearning their language so they can access the teachings even more. I'm so struck when I go in to hear from people how many say, I've got traditional people around me, I'm relearning my language, I'm in ceremony, I've got all kinds of ministry around me, all kinds of teachers, all kinds of midwives, and midwives weren't just there for babies. Midwives nurtured and guided you through all kinds of change in your life. For the Cree in Saskatchewan, when we talk about traditional teachings and who we are and the half-breeds that I know, we come from a tradition that's so rich about who women are. Women own half the sky and half the earth. Imagine that. Women owning half the sky and half the earth. Women hold the teachings of the moon, and men hold the teachings of the sun. What would that be like? What does that mean when it comes to practicing who you are? Any major decisions that were made would have had to include women because we have our own laws. Women were recognized and honored as life givers, the first line of protection for women and elders, and they orchestrated communities. We had our own societies. We're medicine people, herbalists, archivists, genealogists, historians, sharpshooters, hunters, gatherers, ritual keepers. The women that I refer to were integral to maintaining the family, the community, the economy, spiritual practice, and intertribal negotiations. They were the trappers and guides, the Canadian wives of many fur traders who created the European wealth. That's who we're talking about. Now you can pick up a book about Jacques Cartier. You can pick up books and you can walk on our land now and see names of men who came over from Europe, and you'll think that that's what that stands for. That's what that land is. But if you go into our communities and talk to people, you're going to find out that there's traditional names for every square inch of this country. And those women knew what those places were, where they were, and how to maneuver through them. The early Jesuit diaries speak of the resistance that women had to the assimilation into Christianity long after the men had assimilated. The women resisted until the children were dying from new illnesses that their own medicines and ceremonies couldn't touch. They agreed then to convert on a condition, the condition that medicines were provided and the children were protected. I will give you this, I will participate in this, but my babies are dying. I need help. Afterward, of course, many of the women continued to pass on stories, keeping the tradition and culture alive by practicing in places and at times that we wouldn't be caught. There are stories of hiding under tables to practice ceremony, going deep into brush to do ceremony, altering ceremony so that the remnants of it would not die and the children would have access to it. Women, of course, also took roles on in the New Settler Society that were easy enough to take on. Once the reserve system was established, of course, we were forced into taking on different roles. And with the pass system in Saskatchewan, where you couldn't leave the reserve without a pass, women had to figure out other ways to do that and what they could do and when they could get into communities. Lots of people snuck out in the night and would go do some work. Men snuck off to different farms, and the wives had to make it look like the men were still doing the work in the communities. There's lots of stories about women going into communities to go find work because they weren't allowed to kill any of their animals. Their cows were counted, the chickens were counted every day, and you couldn't kill them to eat because the Indian agent would come around and count them. Children were dying, people were getting sick, so families were sneaking out at night to either go get animals from local farmers and kill them or go into town and find work. If you were caught outside the community without a pass, you could be jailed. Or they would take them and publicly humiliate them, cutting off their hair. And so you had to be very careful about how you survived. But you had to go out and do it because the babies were dying. The women I know inspire me and give me hope. And you probably know some of those people yourself. Names that pop up when you look for Indigenous people in your mind. But they're hard to find if you don't know any. Pocahontas? Is that the first one that comes to your mind? I can't say this name very well. It's a Shoshone woman, Sakajaway from the Shoshone, who worked with Lewis and Clark expedition. We have ballerinas. Did you know we have ballerinas? Elizabeth Marie Tallchief was a young woman who committed suicide here a few years ago, and all she wanted was to be a ballerina. That was her biggest dream, was to be a ballerina. We have Maria Campbell, a writer, a teacher, a playwright, a director. We have Louise Haff and Rita Bouvier. We have writers. We have singers. Buffy St. Marie, of course, is from Saskatchewan. We have Georgina Sun, another singer who lives here. We've got Shannon Ludet, who's a runner, an honor runner that is from Saskatchewan. We've got famous people. Buffy would be included in there. Wanique Horn-Miller, an Olympic athlete. We've got all kinds of people that are involved in industry, journalists and activists, politicians, doctors, lawyers, dentists, school teachers, ministers. When I was making this list, I could hear sort of Johnny Cash in the back doing I've Been Everywhere Man, and thinking, could I do a song to that and make this list as long as I could possibly make it? We've got academics and researchers. We've got cooks. We've got gamers. We've got athletes. We've got sex trade workers. We've got plumbers and carpenters, oil workers, horse jockeys, farmers, computer programmers, you name it, we've got it. We've got Indigenous people and work in banks and stores all across this city. Why are we talking about them? Okay, so if I bring it a little bit closer to home about who truly inspired me in the work that I do, and it's been about 9 months or so that the commission's been going, and we're trying to figure out what's our rhythm, what's our step. I'm going to tell you about a woman who has deeply impacted me. She, at a very young age of 5, had to start protecting her siblings. When they were getting beaten, she had to lay on top of them to bear the brunt of what they were taking on. She would offer to be raped so that her siblings weren't touched. She took on foster care systems. She starved herself and demanded they bring her siblings back to her. She was a child. She fought off her foster father. She ran away time and time again from beatings and abuse. She has such a wicked sense of humor. She survived and found her mother and slowly started gathering all of her siblings together who had been taken out of the home. She advocated to get this sister back in their lives, and eventually her sister was brutally raped and murdered. So then she advocated to be part of the trial for her sister. She went to the preliminary hearing, she went to the bail hearing, and then she had to manage to get into the trial, which was far away from her community. She sold everything she had to get to that trial because we don't have any system in place to ensure that the victims who are part of this get to witness what's going on. And bearing witness is another ceremony that we have to acknowledge. So she sold a lot of stuff, and she went into the major center where the trial was, and she sat through that trial. And at the trial, she had to sit for over 3 weeks, the trial for the murder of her sister, and listen to them discuss her as a prostitute and a hooker. So this Indigenous woman who had been through all of the components of our justice system and had been brutalized in many, many ways, decided in the middle of that courtroom to stand up and say to the judge and the prosecutor and the defense lawyer, you're talking about my sister. The judge said, who are you? And she told them their name, and she said, that's my sister that you're talking about. And she has a name, and she has a family, and she was loved, and she had hopes, and she had dreams, and you need to call her by her name. You've reduced her to something that was the smallest part of who she was, and you call her by her name. And her family was worried. That's contemptuous in our justice system. Sit down. And she said, I'm not sitting down. I don't care if they throw me in jail. I want them to use her name. Rosa Parks needs no introduction in this room, none. Everyone in this room knows who that is. Do you know that there's an Indigenous woman that exists that stood up in a courtroom and challenged everything this country stands for in terms of our systems, our safety, our process, and said, I will not take this? That's superhero material if I've ever heard of it. Sandra Lovelace, one of the first women to challenge the legislation that started removing status of Indian women. She said, you can't do this to us. You can't take our identity. Once you take what is a government label for us, maybe, and take it away from us, I can't have access to my community. I can't live there anymore. My family is there and I'm here. I can't go back there. What have you done? And no one here would listen to that. She moved it into an international arena and demanded people understand and recognize we will decide who we are and our own citizenry. We are a nation. We have a say over that. Stop taking our children and stop telling us who we are. We know that. We have amazing people. I wish one day those were the names that came to the top of your head when you realized who Indigenous women in Canada are. What kind of strength does it take to live in a system where you have been raped by institutions, brutalized even in your own family, tossed aside, been told it doesn't matter how she died, been told the case is not ongoing, been told there's no police officer to deal with that right now? What kind of strength does it take to keep pushing that envelope, to keep standing, to keep speaking? This is not for the weak. This is tough work. I have a teacher named Gladys who comes, and she's so close to my heart. And she came and taught with me at a camp in the university, and we were out on the land. It was when the University of Saskatchewan still worked up at Kenderdine campus. And she's teaching the land managers that are from across the country, she's teaching them about nature. So in Indigenous tradition, we have laws that come from spirit, we have laws that come from nature, and then we have human laws just like everybody else. One elder teases and says, those are the ones that you break. You have no choice about the other ones. So I had a student that was really homesick, and she's a single mother, and she insisted on telling a lot of her colleagues how difficult life was because she's a single mother. So Gladys took her aside and said, I want to show you something, come with me. And she took her out, and we were outdoors, and she said, we're going to go look for some deer. Because single parenting, that's not new. Women have been doing this in the animal kingdom for a long time, and we're going to go see what does that deer have to teach us about single parenting. And the next day, we had one of our professors who is a non-Indigenous guy and was a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, was being teased about his inability to hunt and kill. And so they snared a rabbit and he had to kill it, and then he brought it into the camp, and they were telling him, now we're going to teach you how to survive. He's a farmer, so he's on the land all the time, but he wasn't a hunter. We're going to get you to cut this rabbit up and bring it over when you're done. So the elder saw him there, and she went over and she said, what are you doing there? And he said, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm trying to figure out how to deal with this rabbit now that I've killed it. And she said, and then what are you going to do with it? And he said, what should I do with it? I don't know. And she said, you can't take a life for nothing. We have to honor this and we have to eat it. And he says, okay, I am a cook. I can take care of that for sure. I am not exaggerating. Within 10 minutes, completely skinned, chopped up, gutted, here you go. And she wraps it all up in the skin and hands it over to him. And then he goes and he made a pot of soup. And she brought him out in front of everybody, and she honored him with an Indigenous name at the fire because he brought that to us and fed all of the people in the camp. And there was about 40 of us there. And so she did a teaching that day about the people who were teasing him, whether he could hunt or not. And she honored him because he put himself in a vulnerable position and accepted the task that was in front of him. And so she named him. And she told everyone there, this rabbit brings teachings. This soup brings teachings. When you want to know what's happening in your world, there are teachings for that. Go and find them. She teaches me that rocks are animate. This is one of the strongest medicines in nature. This is a gift from her on a day that I was really struggling in a presentation. And she said, you hold that rock. That rock will take everything from you. Rocks are elders gone. They watch us from everywhere. If you feel the rocks around you, pick it up, turn it over, notice the mountains around you. She wants us to become alive to where we are and where we live. I thought about another teacher I had when I was preparing this, and her name's Alma, and she's passed on, and she again taught with me in the land management program, and she taught the students there about Mother Earth. Why is Mother Earth our mother? And she talked about the breast of Mother Earth. And she talked about the fact that water, as the milk of Mother Earth, is our life-sustaining element. She taught that we come to the world in fire, we're kept in water in our mother's uterus, we breathe air, and then we have a walking ceremony to go on the land. She taught the students about honoring themselves and what that means, and that we have different ways to honor ourselves and different people. I've worked with elders who have taken science teachings for grade 10 to 12 students and converted them into traditional teachings and told where you find that science on the land yourself. There are scientists that are right now looking at ladybugs to understand how to make new umbrellas. Everything we need is in nature. There's natural law everywhere. I thought about other women, and I hope you think about the other women in your life. Women who would take anybody in. There were kids in our community that one that didn't have a mother. She had left. And he would end up often, Dad was gone, and it was him and his older brother, and she would take him in at night. She didn't have any money, she didn't get any recognition, she wasn't held up or bronzed in any way by our community, but that was the safe house in our community. And we all have those women in our lives that take us in and look after us. I thought about a couple of women, Gladys and Bernie, who have traveled over this land to say, I'm going to go to every family I can and find out, are you missing someone? Have you lost someone? Tell me your story. I want the world to know what your story is. For no credit, for no money, they're doing this all on their own. They've lost their own family members, and they get up every day and keep going. I thought about all the women who have to endure through racism and stereotypes. I thought about our healers. I thought about every time I go to somebody's house, there's a pot of tea on the stove and often a pot of soup. You might have heard in the news about mold on the houses in our reserve communities. That's one of the stories you might find if you Google Indigenous women in Canada. The reason there's so much mold in our communities is because there's tea and food on the stove all day long to feed whoever comes, to share everything you have with whoever might need it when they come to visit you. That moisture is staying in the houses and causing problems, and they haven't been built in a way to deal with that level of moisture. So when you get told a story about mold, there's a much bigger story attached to that. What's the rest of that story? So I want to thank you for your time. I want to hope that I've opened up some memories to the women in your life, your aunties, your grandmas, your cousins, your neighbors, who look after you and who have endured so much. Because Indigenous women are really strong. They're super women. I love that I'm talking to you the day after Wonder Woman gets out. I love Hidden Figures is out right now. There's all kinds of hidden stories And they're stories of men and boys who have stood and watched and helped. Stories of journalists who have insisted this story be maintained. Police officers who have demanded people be researched and cases stay open. And we need to start hearing those stories so that we can appreciate who we are and the full story of this country and the story of Indigenous women. I don't mean to make small in any way what's happened to our women in this country and the fact that we are being murdered and going missing and experiencing violent trauma and abuse at rates that no one understands yet. But I want you to know the endurance, the strength that it takes to stand up and say, that's enough. That's really hard to do. In Whitehorse, when I was there last week, a group came out and sang a song for us. They made everybody turn their phones and the video cameras off, and they had a woman come in and drum, and her daughter sang for us. And then they did a cry song. And the cry song was 10,000 years old. And they don't do it unless there's a real important reason to do that. Imagine knowing there's a cry song that's 10,000 years old. That's how long Indigenous women have been around here. We've been here since time immemorial. I'm going to get so blasted for that. We've been here from time immemorial, but we can trace songs back for more than 10,000 years to show we've always been here. We're still being here. We're still hoping. We're still pushing. We're still leading. And that Indigenous women are part of the Canadian society, and there's loose threads in that fabric, and we have to mend that. So thank you so much for listening. I look forward to chatting with you at the end of the service, and I wish you all a very good day. Thank you so much.